Saipan, July 1944. American soldiers ordered Japanese women prisoners to undress. What happened next wasn't what anyone expected, and the real reason behind this order would challenge everything both sides believed about their enemy. This is a story the history books barely whispered about. The tropical heat hit Nurse Takahashi Yuki like a wall as she emerged from the cave. Her hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion after 3 weeks of hiding in the darkness of Saipan's limestone tunnels. The sound of American boots crunching on volcanic rock made her stomach twist into knots. This was it. This was the moment the propaganda had warned her about. The moment she would face the monsters who would surely torture her before killing her. Around her, 30 other Japanese civilian women stood in various states of shock. Some wept silently. Others stared ahead with the blank expression of people who had already accepted death. Harumi Nakamura, a schoolteacher from Tokyo, gripped Yuki's arm so tightly it hurt. They had become friends in the darkness of the cave, sharing stories of their lives before the war, before everything changed. The American soldiers who surrounded them looked nothing like the demons Japanese propaganda had described. They were young, some barely older than teenagers. Private First Class Daniel Cooper, a farm boy from Iowa, kept his rifle lowered, his eyes darting between the women with an expression that seemed more uncomfortable than aggressive. But Yuki knew appearances could deceive. She had been taught that Americans were expert manipulators. Colonel William Bradshaw stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the jungle humidity. He held no weapon. Instead, he carried a clipboard and what appeared to be medical supplies. Through an interpreter, he spoke words that made no sense to Yuki. Medical examination, decontamination procedures, Geneva Convention protocols. The words felt like a trick, a cruel game before the inevitable. Captain Margaret Foster appeared next, her nurse's insignia visible on her uniform. Margaret had volunteered for this assignment specifically. After losing her brother at Pearl Harbor, she had wanted to be anywhere the fight against Japan took her. But standing here now, looking at these terrified women, she felt something unexpected. They reminded her of the patients she had treated back in San Francisco. They were just people, scared, hungry, exhausted people. The order came through the interpreter. The women needed to undress for medical examination and decontamination. The reaction was immediate. Several women began to cry harder. 2 tried to run, but were gently stopped by female military personnel who had been standing nearby. Yuki felt her world collapse. This was it. The moment she had been warned about. The moment that confirmed every horrible story she had heard. But then something strange happened. The male soldiers were ordered to turn around and move back 50 yards. Large canvas screens were erected, creating a private area. Captain Foster and other female nurses stepped forward, their hands empty of weapons, filled instead with medical supplies, clean towels, and folded clothing. Margaret's voice was firm but not unkind as she explained through the interpreter what would happen next. Harumi whispered a question that Yuki was thinking. Why were they being given privacy if the Americans planned to hurt them? Why were only women present in the examination area? The interpreter, a Japanese-American woman named Susan Tanaka, explained patiently that this was standard military protocol for all prisoners of war. Decontamination to prevent disease. Medical examination to identify injuries or illnesses that needed treatment. Provision of clean clothing to replace the filthy, torn garments most wore after weeks in the caves. Yuki watched as the first group of women, still terrified but with no other choice, began to comply. She watched Captain Foster's face carefully, searching for signs of cruelty or mockery. Instead, she saw professional efficiency mixed with something that looked almost like compassion. Margaret worked quickly, documenting injuries, identifying malnutrition, noting cases of dysentery and infected wounds. Her touch was clinical but gentle, the same way Yuki herself had touched patients back when she worked in the hospital in Garapan before the invasion. The decontamination station was set up with military precision. DDT powder to kill lice and prevent typhus. Medicated soap to treat skin infections that had festered in the humid caves. Clean water, an unimaginable luxury after weeks of surviving on whatever could be found. And then, perhaps most surprising of all, clean clothes. Not the ragged remains of what they had been wearing, but actual garments, distributed according to size. When Yuki's turn came, she forced herself to move forward. Her nurse training helped her detach emotionally, to treat this as a clinical procedure. She undressed behind the canvas screen, her skin prickling with vulnerability. Captain Foster approached, and Yuki flinched instinctively. Margaret paused, then spoke softly. The interpreter translated, "Nobody here will hurt you. We are following the rules of war. You are protected under international law." The examination revealed what Margaret had seen too many times already that day. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, multiple infected cuts and abrasions, signs of extreme stress. Yuki had lost at least 30 pounds since the invasion began. Her nursing uniform, once pristine white, had been reduced to stained rags. Margaret made notes on her clipboard, then did something unexpected. She pulled out a canteen and offered Yuki water. Real, clean water. Yuki's hands shook as she drank. The decontamination process was humiliating in its thoroughness but clinical in its execution. DDT powder dusted over her hair and body. A rough but clean towel to wipe away weeks of grime. Medicated ointment applied to infected wounds. And then the clothes. A simple cotton dress, clean and intact. Underwear. Even shoes, though they were military issue and too large. Yuki dressed quickly, her mind struggling to reconcile what was happening with what she had been told would happen. As she emerged from behind the screen, she saw something that made her pause. Private Cooper, who had been standing with his back turned the entire time, was sharing his rations with some of the women who had already been processed. He looked awkward about it, almost embarrassed. But he was dividing his chocolate bar into small pieces and offering them to the children among the group. Colonel Bradshaw watched the entire operation with careful attention. He had been at Tarawa. He had seen the mass civilian deaths when Japanese propaganda convinced people to jump from cliffs rather than surrender. He had watched children throw themselves into the ocean, choosing death over capture because they believed Americans would torture them. He had made a decision then. Every prisoner under his command would be treated with strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, not just because it was the law, but because it was the right thing to do. And maybe, just maybe, if they treated prisoners humanely, word would spread, and more civilians would surrender, instead of choosing death. The medical examinations revealed disturbing patterns. Nearly all the women showed signs of severe malnutrition. Several had injuries from the naval bombardment that had preceded the invasion. 2 were pregnant. One elderly woman had a broken arm that had been set improperly and would need to be rebroken and reset. A teenage girl had burns covering 20% of her body from a phosphorus grenade. All of them carried psychological trauma that Margaret knew would take years, perhaps lifetimes, to heal. But there was something else the examinations revealed, something that challenged the propaganda both sides had been fed. These were not the fanatical warriors American soldiers had been told all Japanese were. They were nurses, teachers, shopkeepers, mothers. They had been caught in a war they never asked for, surviving in caves because they genuinely believed surrender meant torture and death. The propaganda had done its job too well. Harumi, after her examination, approached the interpreter Susan with questions. Where would they be taken? What would happen to them? Would they be killed later when the cameras were gone? Susan, who had spent the entire war fighting her own battle against prejudice in America because of her Japanese ancestry, answered honestly. They would be taken to a POW camp on Guam. They would be fed, given medical care, and housed according to international law. Eventually, after the war ended, they would be repatriated to Japan. The concept seemed impossible to Harumi. She had been a teacher in Tokyo, teaching children that Americans were devils, that surrender was worse than death. She had believed it because everyone believed it. The government said it. The newspapers said it. The radio broadcasts said it. How could it all be wrong? Yet here she was, wearing clean clothes, her infected foot bandaged properly, having been treated with a professionalism that contradicted everything she thought she knew. As the processing continued throughout the day, Private Cooper found himself struggling with his own thoughts. He had joined the Marines wanting revenge. His best friend had died at Guadalcanal. Another buddy was killed by a Japanese sniper just 3 days ago during the push across Saipan. He had wanted to hate these people. It was easier to fight when you could hate. But watching the terrified women emerge from the caves, seeing the malnourished children, hearing the stories of families torn apart, he found his hate wavering. They were the enemy, yes, but they were also just people caught in the machinery of war. Captain Foster worked late into the evening, processing the last of the women. Her back ached, and her hands were raw from constant washing and disinfecting. But she pushed on because this work mattered. Each woman documented, examined, treated, and properly clothed was a small victory against the inhumanity of war. When she finally finished, she sat down on a supply crate and allowed herself a moment of exhaustion. Colonel Bradshaw approached with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Margaret. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of orange and red. Finally, Bradshaw spoke. Tomorrow they would process another group. There were thousands of Japanese civilians scattered across the island, hiding in caves, terrified to surrender. Everyone they could convince to come out peacefully was one less tragedy. Every prisoner treated humanely was proof that the propaganda was wrong. Margaret sipped her coffee and asked the question that had been bothering her all day. What happened to make them so afraid of us? Bradshaw explained what military intelligence had pieced together. The Japanese government had spent years preparing civilians for invasion. They had shown propaganda films of atrocities, most fabricated or taken out of context. They had distributed grenades to civilians with instructions to use them on themselves and their families rather than surrender. They had told mothers it was more merciful to kill their children than let them be captured by Americans. The propaganda machine had created a self-fulfilling prophecy of horror. But there was another side to the story, one that made Bradshaw uncomfortable to discuss. Not all American soldiers followed the rules. There had been incidents, moments when rage and revenge overcame discipline. Japanese soldiers had committed horrific atrocities against American prisoners and Chinese civilians. Some Americans wanted payback. It was Bradshaw's job to prevent that, to maintain discipline, to ensure that American forces operated according to the laws of war, even when the enemy did not. It was not always easy, and he did not always succeed. Inside the temporary holding area, Yuki sat on a cot, the first real bed she had experienced in weeks. Around her, other women whispered in confusion and cautious hope. The food they had been given was simple but plentiful. Rice, canned vegetables, even some fruit. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but they stayed outside the fence, maintaining security without entering the women's space. It was all so different from what they had expected. Harumi lay on the cot next to Yuki, staring at the canvas roof of the tent. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. What if everything we were told was a lie? What if the emperor was wrong? What if the generals were wrong? The questions were dangerous, potentially treasonous. But here, among women who had all faced the same shock of humane treatment, the questions felt necessary. Yuki responded with her own observation. She had been a nurse. She had seen Captain Foster work. The American woman was a professional, skilled and thorough. She had treated Yuki's wounds with the same care Yuki herself would have provided to her own patients. There was no mockery, no cruelty, just medical care. How could that be reconciled with the stories of American barbarism? The next morning brought new routines. Breakfast was distributed. More medical examinations for those who needed follow-up care. The pregnant women were taken to a proper medical facility for prenatal checkups. Children were given extra rations and vitamins. Elderly prisoners received special accommodations. It was all so systematized, so organized. The Americans treated prisoner processing like they treated everything else, with military efficiency and documented procedures. Susan Tanaka, the interpreter, found herself in high demand. She spent hours translating, explaining, reassuring. Born in California to Japanese immigrant parents, she had been studying at Berkeley when Pearl Harbor happened. While her parents and younger siblings were sent to internment camps, Susan had volunteered for military service, determined to prove her loyalty to America. Now she stood between two worlds, helping terrified Japanese civilians understand that surrender did not mean death. Private Cooper pulled guard duty that night, patrolling the perimeter of the POW holding area. Through the fence he could see the women settling into sleep. Some still cried quietly. Others comforted children. He thought about his mother back in Iowa, how she would react if Iowa were invaded, if she had to hide in caves, if she faced capture by enemy soldiers. Would she be this scared? Would she believe propaganda that told her to choose death over surrender? The realization hit him hard. These prisoners were not so different from his own family. They had been caught on the wrong side of a war, fed lies by their government, terrified into believing surrender meant torture and death. The real crime was not what happened when they undressed for medical examination. The real crime was that they had been so thoroughly convinced that humane treatment was impossible. Colonel Bradshaw filed his reports with careful detail. Numbers of prisoners processed, medical conditions documented, supplies used, incidents reported. There had been one problem that day when a soldier made an inappropriate comment. Bradshaw had dealt with it immediately, removing the soldier from prisoner contact and issuing formal discipline. There would be no tolerance for misconduct, not under his command. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Word spread among the civilians still hiding in caves. Some surrendered because they were starving and had no choice. But others surrendered because they had heard from those already in custody that the Americans were following rules, providing food and medical care, treating prisoners humanely. The propaganda was losing its power in the face of documented reality. Yuki found herself in an unusual position. Her medical training made her valuable, and Captain Foster requested her help as a medical assistant in the POW camp clinic. Working alongside her former enemy felt strange, but Yuki discovered that medical care transcended nationality. A wound was a wound regardless of whose body it was on. An illness required treatment whether the patient was Japanese or American. In the clinic, nationality mattered less than need. Harumi took on teaching duties, helping Japanese children in the camp continue their education. She taught reading, writing, mathematics, but she found herself questioning what else to teach. Should she continue lessons about Japanese superiority and divine destiny? Should she teach the propaganda she now knew was false? Or should she teach something else, something closer to truth? It was a question that kept her awake at night. Private Cooper requested transfer to prisoner liaison duties. His motivation surprised even himself. He wanted to help. After weeks of combat, of killing and watching friends die, he needed to do something constructive. Working with civilians, helping distribute food and supplies, playing simple games with the children to make them smile, it felt like reclaiming a piece of his humanity that the war had tried to take. The pregnant women received special attention. Margaret personally oversaw their care, ensuring proper nutrition and prenatal vitamins. When one went into labor prematurely, the full resources of the field hospital were deployed. American doctors and nurses worked through the night to save both mother and child. They succeeded. The baby, born in enemy hands, received the same level of care as any American infant. That birth became a turning point for many. Yuki assisted in the delivery, working alongside Captain Foster. Two women, enemies in a war neither started, working together to bring life into a world consumed by death. After the delivery, as they cleaned up, Margaret spoke through Susan the interpreter. Life is life. It doesn't matter whose side we're on. We're both nurses. We both took oaths to preserve life. That's what matters. Colonel Bradshaw received commendation from higher command for his handling of civilian prisoners. His methods were being studied and implemented across other Pacific islands. The realization was spreading through military command that humane treatment of prisoners was not just morally right but strategically valuable. Every civilian who surrendered safely was one less person the military had to dig out of caves at the cost of American lives. But not everyone was happy with the policies. Some soldiers felt that treating the enemy too well was a betrayal of fallen comrades. They remembered friends killed by Japanese soldiers. They remembered stories of American prisoners tortured and executed. They wanted revenge, not compassion. Bradshaw faced these challenges regularly, explaining that America's strength came from maintaining standards even when the enemy did not, especially when the enemy did not. Months passed. The war continued across the Pacific, but in the POW camps on Saipan and Guam, a different kind of warfare occurred. A battle against propaganda, against prejudice, against the dehumanization that war demands. It was fought with medical care, adequate food, clean water, and adherence to law. It was not a perfect system. Mistakes were made. Some prisoners were mistreated. Some guards failed to maintain standards. But the overall policy held. Prisoners would be treated humanely. Yuki wrote letters that would eventually be delivered to family in Japan after the war. She described her capture, her fear, and then the reality of her treatment. She described working in the clinic, learning from American medical techniques, discovering that compassion existed even between enemies. She wondered if her letters would be believed or dismissed as propaganda. Harumi taught her students about mathematics and science, carefully avoiding politics. She taught them that knowledge was valuable regardless of nationality. American and Japanese scientists studied the same periodic table. Mathematical formulas worked the same way everywhere. Truth was truth, regardless of which flag flew overhead. It was a subtle rebellion against the propaganda that had led them all to this place. Private Cooper received letters from home describing the internment of Japanese Americans, the suspicion and prejudice they faced. He found it deeply ironic that while he guarded Japanese prisoners with orders to treat them humanely, Japanese Americans who were loyal citizens faced imprisonment without trial. War made hypocrites of everyone, he decided. The best you could do was try to act with decency in your own small sphere of influence. Captain Foster was promoted to major and given oversight of medical operations for multiple POW camps. Her reports documented not just physical health but psychological recovery. The initial terror had faded for most prisoners, replaced by cautious acceptance. Some even expressed gratitude for medical care that exceeded what they would have received in Japanese military facilities. The contrast between propaganda and reality had created cognitive dissonance that many were still processing. When August 1945 brought the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender, the mood in the camps was complex. Relief that the war was over, mixed with horror at the destruction. Many prisoners had family in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The news was devastating. Yet even in that moment, American medical personnel provided psychological support, helping prisoners cope with grief and loss. Repatriation came slowly. Ships had to be arranged, ports prepared, countless administrative details handled. During the waiting period, relationships deepened. Yuki and Margaret had developed a genuine friendship despite the language barrier. They had saved lives together, worked exhausting shifts together, shared the particular bond that medical professionals develop. The war that had made them enemies had also made them colleagues. The day finally came when the first ships departed, carrying Japanese civilians back to their devastated homeland. Yuki stood on the deck, watching Saipan recede into the distance. She thought about everything that had happened since that terrifying day when she emerged from the cave expecting death and receiving medical care instead. She thought about the propaganda that had nearly convinced her to take her own life rather than surrender. She thought about what she would tell people when she returned home. Harumi carried notebooks filled with lesson plans and educational materials that American teachers had shared with her. She was returning to a Japan that had been bombed into submission, and she knew education would be crucial for rebuilding. But she would teach differently now. She would teach critical thinking, questioning, the importance of seeking truth beyond propaganda. She would teach that enemies could show compassion, that surrender did not mean death, that humanity could persist even in war. Private Cooper stood on the dock watching the ships depart. He had started this war wanting revenge for his friend's death. He was ending it having played games with Japanese children, having helped distribute food to hungry families, having witnessed births and deaths and all the complicated humanity between. He wondered if the prisoners he had guarded would remember him, if they would tell their children about the American soldiers who treated them according to law rather than hate. Colonel Bradshaw filed his final reports on POW operations. Thousands of civilians processed, thousands of lives saved, countless cases of disease treated, injuries healed, children fed. The numbers told one story. But there was another story in the letters Japanese civilians sent back after returning home, describing their treatment, contradicting the propaganda, slowly changing perceptions. Years later, historians would examine the treatment of Japanese POWs in American custody. The record was imperfect, with documented cases of mistreatment and violations. But overall, American forces had largely adhered to Geneva Convention protocols. Prisoners were examined medically, decontaminated, clothed, fed, and housed according to law. The order to undress for medical examination, which had seemed so sinister to terrified prisoners, had been exactly what it claimed to be, a standard military procedure to prevent disease and document health status. The real shock was not what American soldiers did to Japanese women prisoners after they undressed. The real shock was that they treated them humanely. The real shock was medical care instead of torture, clean clothes instead of degradation, food instead of starvation. The real shock was discovering that the propaganda was wrong, that enemies could show compassion, that international law actually meant something. For Yuki, the experience changed her fundamentally. She returned to nursing in Japan, working in hospitals overwhelmed with wounded and sick. She brought with her medical techniques learned from Captain Foster, protocols for sanitation and disease prevention that she had observed in the POW camps. She never spoke publicly about her captivity, knowing the shame associated with surrender in Japanese culture. But privately, she knew the truth. Surrender had saved her life. Harumi became an educator in post-war Japan, part of the generation that rebuilt the country from ashes. She taught her students to question authority, to seek truth, to recognize propaganda. She taught them that former enemies had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty, and that lesson was perhaps the most valuable thing she could pass on. Critical thinking, she believed, was the best defense against the kind of indoctrination that had led Japan into catastrophic war. Cooper returned to his Iowa farm, married, raised children. He rarely spoke about the war like many veterans, but when his children asked what he did in the Pacific, he told them about guarding prisoners, about trying to maintain humanity in inhumane circumstances. He taught them that enemies were still people, that following moral principles mattered even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. Margaret continued her nursing career, eventually becoming a hospital administrator in California. She maintained correspondence with Susan Tanaka, the interpreter who had bridged worlds. They discussed the irony that Japanese Americans had been imprisoned in their own country, while helping to process Japanese nationals as POWs overseas. The war had been full of such ironies, contradictions that would take decades to fully process. The story of what happened when Japanese women prisoners were ordered to undress became one of those historical footnotes that rarely made it into textbooks. It was not dramatic enough for war stories, not clear-cut enough for propaganda. It was complicated, nuanced, human. It showed that even in total war, standards could be maintained. It showed that propaganda could be overcome by direct experience. It showed that humanity could persist in circumstances designed to destroy it. The real reason the order was given was mundane: disease prevention, medical documentation, basic hygiene, standard military procedure applied to prisoners of war as required by international law. But the impact of that order and the humane treatment that followed rippled through time. Prisoners who expected death received care. Families eventually reunited. Children grew up who might otherwise have died in caves or jumped from cliffs. The body count of the war did not increase by thousands of unnecessary civilian deaths. In the grand scope of World War II, with its millions of casualties and massive battles, the processing of civilian prisoners on Saipan might seem like a minor detail, but to the people involved, it was everything. To Yuki, it was the difference between life and death. To Harumi, it was a lesson that shaped her life's work. To Cooper, it was a reminder of shared humanity. To Margaret, it was an opportunity to practice her profession according to its highest ideals. To Bradshaw, it was proof that standards mattered. The Pacific War was marked by exceptional brutality on both sides. Japanese treatment of American and Allied POWs was horrific, with death rates of over 25%, compared to less than 1% for German-held POWs. American forces sometimes killed Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender, sometimes mistreated prisoners, sometimes failed to maintain standards. The war brought out the worst in humanity, but it also occasionally brought out the best. The decision to strictly enforce Geneva Convention protocols for civilian prisoners was one of those moments. It was not universal, and it was not perfect, but it happened often enough to matter. Thousands of Japanese civilians survived the war because they were treated humanely after capture. Their stories, mostly untold, represent a different narrative about the Pacific War. What happened after Japanese women prisoners undressed for medical examination shocked everyone because it defied expectations on both sides. Japanese prisoners expected torture and death based on their government's propaganda. Some American soldiers expected to see enemy combatants deserving of revenge. Instead, both sides encountered humanity. Medical professionals doing their jobs, civilians caught in war, soldiers following orders to maintain standards, people trying to preserve decency in indecent circumstances. The legacy of these encounters is difficult to measure. Did humane treatment of prisoners shorten the war by encouraging surrender? Possibly. Did it change post-war relations between America and Japan? Perhaps in small ways. Did it matter to the individuals involved? Absolutely. For every person whose life was saved, every injury treated, every child fed, it mattered completely. So remember this. When you hear stories about war, about enemies, about the necessity of hatred and dehumanization, remember that even in the Pacific War, even in some of the most bitter fighting humanity has seen, moments of decency occurred. Remember that propaganda can be wrong. Remember that enemies are human. Remember that maintaining standards, following laws, treating prisoners humanely, is not weakness, but strength. Remember that what happened after those prisoners undressed was not horror, but hope. Medical care, clean clothes, food, water, treatment according to law and basic human dignity. That was the real shock. That was the real story, and that is what everyone should know. If this story opened your eyes to an untold chapter of World War II, subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. Hit that like button if you believe in uncovering the truth beyond propaganda. Drop a comment below and tell us what other forgotten stories from the Pacific War we should explore next. History is complicated, nuanced, and human. Let's keep discovering it together.